just 2 weeks ago, the BBC aired Climate Change, The Facts with David Attenborough, and it really felt like for the first time the BBC didn't beat around the bush when it came to climate breakdown. So why do we have to wait, do you think, until Sir Dave says it before we pay attention?
Well, in truth, he wasn't saying it either. I mean, until very recently. This is the latest late flowering there's ever been. And his transformation into a radical environmentalist in his 93rd year is something we should welcome and celebrate. Because for me, it's been intensely frustrating. I mean, I started work. My first, in fact, my only job, my only proper job, proper full-time job, was here at the Natural History Unit in Bristol.
Yeah.
And I came here to make investigative environmental programs. They didn't exist at the time, and I basically beat down the door saying, look, you've got to be doing this. I know how to do this. I can do it for you. And I was eventually let in with the words, you're so fucking persistent, you've got the job. Yes. That is a verbatim quote from the head of the unit. Because it was the only thing I wanted to do. I was completely single-minded about this. I couldn't believe that it wasn't doing this stuff.
Yeah, to give that some context, that was like back in 1985.
85, yes. Yeah. So this was, you know, when you could still film the dinosaurs. And we made some fantastic programs. You know, we cracked some really big stories, and I thought, well, this is me. This is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, because it's great. We've got the resources of the BBC, and it's really, you know, what the BBC can do is completely different to what other media can do, because it's so big. It's got such public reach, and it's got so much money. But then Mrs. Thatcher launched her coup against the BBC. It had made these programs which had really embarrassed her. One called Secret Society about government spending, which wasn't approved by Parliament. Another one called Maggie's Militant Tendency about the people in her cabinet who had formerly been in fascist organisations. And for some reason, this didn't go down very well.
It did sound like a porn film anyway.
And so, you know, with her great commitment, her long-touted commitment to freedom, she shut the whole thing down. She sacked the Director General, Alistair Milne. She put an accountant in his place who was kind of all right but didn't know what he was doing. And then he went and this horrible John Birt came in instead. And the whole thing just became completely hostile to any interesting program making. In fact, the day that Alistair Milne was sacked, my boss came in and said, that's it, we've had it from the top, no more investigative programs. So this was the point at which I decided to leave the BBC.
Yeah. But
I did so with a heavy heart because, you know, nothing else was going to replicate that platform. And but you know, I realised it was then dead from the neck up, and it's remained that way. But possibly, you know, there's some glimmering of life beginning to return. It's very interesting. If you look at the difference between Blue Planet Live, which was the series they did a few weeks ago, cashing in on the success of Blue Planet 2, and Climate Change, The Facts, they could belong to different eras. It's almost as if some major change happened between those two programs. Blue Planet Live was pathetic, absolutely pathetic. It was all about, terrible things are happening to the oceans. We can't tell you exactly what they are, except it's bad.
Yeah.
You know, so
let's look at a blue whale.
That's
let's
right,
see if we
exactly.
can see one of those.
And it's like, so what about the commercial fishing industry? We got a minute on the commercial fishing industry. That was it, industrial fishing. You know, industrial fishing is by far and away the biggest threat to the oceans. We had quite a lot about climate issues, but it was all sort of like, this mysterious thing called climate change is happening. They didn't explain why it was happening, who was driving it, what the forces were. We ought to do something about it. Well, what? What are we going to do? They didn't tell us. Except do some coral seeding. We got some scientists coming to the rescue. And all these little micro techno fixes with no systemic challenge at all.
Yeah, just beating around the bush.
That's right. And that had characterised all BBC attempts at environmental programme making up till that point pretty well. With one or two very rare exceptions. Attenborough's previous climate film, in 2006, called The Truth About Climate Change, was a total disaster. And it set back the cause of climate action by years. Because not only did it completely fail to explain what the issue was and where it was coming from. In fact, the only mention of fossil fuel companies in the whole programme was as part of the solution, Statoil burying carbon dioxide in its reservoirs with this carbon capture and storage thing. Otherwise, they weren't mentioned at all. The only clear force which was blamed was the Chinese, the yellow peril. You know, it was shocking, disgraceful. No mention of the fact that the reason Chinese emissions were rising was they were manufacturing our goods. And so what that did immediately was to create this whole new front in climate change denial. And I was, from that moment, bombarded with messages saying, it's not us, it's the Chinese, we don't have to worry about it, what's the point in Britain acting, we're only 2%, look at the Chinese doing all this stuff, those wretched Chinese. And so it was completely counterproductive, and it was typical of the cowardice of the BBC. But something has changed. And it's like a switch.
You called him on it, didn't you?
I did. I mean, I wrote this article saying that David Attenborough basically betrayed the living world that he loved. And it was, you know, again and again, just flinching, refusing to name the powers. And, you know, as Walter Wink, the great theologian, pointed out, that is the first step. You cannot confront the powers until you have named them. You name them, you unmask them, you confront them. Those are the 3 steps of action. And if you can't even bloody name them, you can't start that process of activism. And it was like, we're not going to talk about this. And up until this point, or until about a few months ago, the only forces that Attenborough would talk about were things like population growth. Basically, people in other nations, much poorer than ourselves, having too many children. Never mind our consumption growth, which is going far higher and far faster and shows no sign of peaking at all, unlike population growth. And he said some deeply racist and unpleasant things about that. You know, basically saying we shouldn't have given aid to the Ethiopians during the famine because it only encouraged them. Wow. You know, quite extraordinary stuff. Yeah. But suddenly, in the past few months, there's been this flip, this turnaround. I'd love to take credit for it, but
you can take
I don't think I could.
Do you think that that it could have the same effect for the Earth that Blue Planet 2 had for the oceans?
Well, Blue Planet 2 was a complete dog's breakfast. So we'd had this, it was the last of the programs in the Blue Planet 2 series. I mean, the one we're talking about is the environmental one. So the first 5 programs, which were all about the wonders of the ocean, were really good. You know, they're really spectacular. I mean, they're a bit scientifically dodgy, but it was beautiful filmmaking. It was great storytelling. There were very clear, discrete stories telling you about these amazing life forms and their behavior, and it filled you with wonder and astonishment. All the time in the back of my mind is that, yeah, this whole lot is being treated by us as seafood. But, you know, we saw, look, here's this amazing behavior of this extraordinary wrasse, and look at the incredible things we do, and basically, yeah, that's going to end up on someone's plate. Yeah, this is seafood. That's our main engagement with it. So I was thinking, well, in the last program, they're going to tell us all about that, aren't they? And it was a total mess from start to finish, because they were so afraid of naming the powers. Yeah. So the only mention of commercial fishing, industrial fishing, the big threat, was this Norwegian herring fishery. And look, aren't they lovely, because they're releasing the orcas and they've got this new way of doing it. Now, the Norwegian herring fishery is one of the 1% of fisheries around the planet which is in recovery. They didn't tell us that. They didn't tell us that all the other fisheries are trashing the entire marine ecosystem. And instead, there was a little bit of climate stuff, and it was just sort of pulled back always from the brink. So we can't actually tell you why it's happening, or even particularly what it's doing. And then there was plastic stuff, and the plastic stuff was handled so badly. It was absolutely chaotic. It was terrible storytelling, terrible filmmaking. It was like
vaguely linking, like, you know, this calf may have died because of the milk, may have been contaminated with toxins from plastic pollution.
It was all over the shop, and it also was actually seriously misled us, because most of the plastic coming into the ocean is coming from a few countries, going down a few rivers, which haven't got good waste disposal systems. But the impression it gave was that all the plastic that we're using is ending up in the ocean.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, a lot of our plastic does end up in those countries.
It gets sold to,
where
but
those 10 rivers
that's
are.
right. But that wasn't explained either.
No.
So, you know, none of it was properly explained. Moreover, it didn't point out that a huge amount of marine plastic, and by far the most dangerous portion for marine life, is discarded fishing gear. So 46% of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is nets, is ghost fishing nets. A large proportion of the rest of the patch is other fishing gear. Plastic buoys, all net floats, all the sort of bits and pieces of paraphernalia of fishing. And again, it's just like we can't go there because that would actually be taking on some interest. It didn't mention the plastics industry and its expansion plans, its way of selling plastic, there's none of that stuff. And so you've got this really crazy stuff happening. So there was a prominent environmentalist who tweeted this picture of her plastic Tupperware, which she had taken to Tesco, and it was success, and it was this great sort of triumph. Look, I got them to put my king prawns in my plastic Tupperware instead of in a plastic bag. And she linked it to a campaign to save the oceans. King prawns is about the most disastrous thing you could possibly buy.